On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, 3 German armies attacked through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The Americans didn't see it coming. Not because the intelligence was bad, though it was. Not because the weather was terrible, though it was. But because the fundamental assumption that shaped every Allied planning decision in the fall of 1944 was that Germany was finished. That after the breakout from Normandy, after the liberation of Paris, after the German retreat across France and Belgium that had cost the Wehrmacht hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles, the enemy was too broken to mount a serious counteroffensive. That assumption was wrong. 250,000 German soldiers attacked through 30 miles of thinly held American lines in what would become the largest land battle in American military history. In the first 4 days, they advanced 50 miles, encircled an entire American division at Bastogne, and came within striking distance of the Meuse River, the first major geographic obstacle between the German spearhead and the Allied supply base at Antwerp. If they reached Antwerp, Hitler's plan was simple: split the Allied armies in two, force a negotiated peace on the Western Front, and transfer the freed German divisions to the east before the Soviets could launch their winter offensive. It almost worked. Not because Germany had the strength to win, but because the Americans, for 4 days, didn't know what was hitting them. This is the story of Hitler's last gamble, the operation that should have been impossible, the battle that almost succeeded, and why it was always going to fail. To understand why the Battle of the Bulge almost worked, you need to understand what the Western Front looked like in December 1944, and specifically, why the Ardennes was the weakest point in the Allied line. By December 1944, Allied forces stretched from the North Sea coast of the Netherlands to the Swiss border, a front of roughly 600 miles. Eisenhower's armies had advanced so rapidly after the Normandy breakout that by September, they had outrun their supply lines. The decision to halt the advance and consolidate before pushing into Germany meant that some sectors of the front received far fewer troops than their length required. The Ardennes was one of those sectors. Military doctrine taught that the Ardennes, a heavily forested, hilly region with narrow roads and poor trafficability in winter, was unsuitable for major armored operations. The Germans had proven that doctrine wrong in May 1940, when they had used exactly that assumption to achieve complete surprise by attacking through the Ardennes and encircling the Allied armies in France and Belgium. But by December 1944, the lesson hadn't been fully absorbed. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a place where tired divisions could rest, and new divisions could gain frontline experience without being exposed to serious combat. The 8th Corps, under General Troy Middleton, held roughly 80 miles of Ardennes front with 4 divisions, a density of coverage that left each division responsible for a sector far larger than standard doctrine recommended for offensive operations. What made this vulnerability catastrophic was the Allied intelligence failure. German security surrounding Operation Watch on the Rhine was the most effective in the entire war. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Troop movements happened at night. Aerial reconnaissance was hampered by cloud cover, and the fundamental assumption among Allied intelligence officers that Germany couldn't mount a major offensive because it didn't have the resources meant that warning signs that should have been investigated were dismissed as evidence of defensive preparations. Colonel Benjamin Monk Dixon, the First Army's intelligence officer, submitted a report on December 10th warning of German offensive preparations in the Ardennes. His warning was overridden by the prevailing consensus. 6 days later, the offensive began. The German operation assembled approximately 250,000 soldiers, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 1,900 artillery pieces, more armor than Germany had committed to any single operation since Kursk. This force had been assembled in complete secrecy over 6 weeks, moved to the front at night, and positioned for the attack without being detected by Allied intelligence. It was the most sophisticated deception operation Germany conducted in the entire war. Hitler's plan for Watch on the Rhine was as ambitious as anything the Wehrmacht had attempted since Barbarossa. The main thrust would be carried by the 6th SS Panzer Army under SS General Joseph Sepp Dietrich in the north, attacking through the northern Ardennes toward Liège and then Antwerp. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel would attack in the center, aiming for the Meuse crossings near Namur. The 7th Army would cover the southern flank. The Germans needed to reach the Meuse within 4 days. Every German general who analyzed the plan understood why. Once Allied air power could operate, once the weather cleared, the Luftwaffe could not provide adequate air cover, and the exposed German armored columns would be destroyed from the air. The window of bad weather that grounded Allied aircraft was the operation's most essential prerequisite, and it could not last indefinitely. Speed was everything, and from the beginning, speed was the one thing the operation could not achieve. The northern thrust under Dietrich ran into problems within hours of the initial attack. The 99th Infantry Division, a relatively inexperienced American unit that had never seen serious combat, held its positions long enough to allow the 1st and 2nd SS Panzer Divisions to be channeled into a narrower front than the plan required. The road network in the northern Ardennes, adequate for the volumes of traffic the plan assumed, became choked with vehicles when the advance slowed. Traffic jams formed behind the forward units, preventing the follow-on forces from moving up to exploit the initial breakthrough. The critical failure in the north came at the twin villages of Lanzerath and at the Lanzerath Ridge. American soldiers from the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, falling back in good order, established a defensive position on the ridge that the Germans could not break. Every hour they held the ridge was an hour the main German thrust could not complete its turn north toward Liège. Dietrich's army never reached Liège. In the center, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army performed significantly better. His forces crossed the Our River, broke through the 106th Infantry Division, capturing most of 2 regiments in what became the largest surrender of American forces since Patton, and drove deep into the Belgian countryside. The 116th Panzer Division and the 2nd Panzer Division moved with a speed that briefly seemed to justify Hitler's calculations. And then they reached Bastogne. Private First Class Lyle Buch, commanding a 16-man intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 99th Infantry Division, at a position called Lanzerath Ridge on December 16th, described in his memoir what his small unit did when they found themselves facing the advance guard of the 1st SS Panzer Division. We had 16 men and a handful of machine guns. They had thousands of soldiers in armor. The conventional decision was to fall back. But if we fell back, there was nothing behind us for miles. So we stayed. We held that ridge for the entire first day of the German offensive. By the time they overran us at night, we'd bought enough time that the units behind us had started to organize a defensive line. 16 men against the spearhead of Hitler's last offensive. I'm not telling you we were heroes. I'm telling you we didn't know what else to do. Buch's platoon held Lanzerath Ridge against repeated assaults by a German paratroop regiment for most of December 16th, inflicting casualties far out of proportion to their numbers and delaying the advance of Kampfgruppe Piper, the most powerful German armored spearhead in the entire offensive, by a full day. That delay would prove critical. If this is giving you a different way to think about what America's biggest land battle actually looked like, subscribe and hit the bell. New video every week. Back to the story. Bastogne was the hinge on which the entire battle turned. The town sat at the center of a road network that controlled movement through the Ardennes. 7 major roads converged on Bastogne. Any German advance into Belgium that bypassed Bastogne would have exposed flanks that could be cut from the town. Taking it, or at least encircling it to prevent it from being used as a base for counterattack, was essential to the German plan. The 101st Airborne Division rushed from its rest area in Reims by truck, without winter equipment, without adequate ammunition, without complete unit organization, arrived in Bastogne just ahead of the German encirclement. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe took command of the garrison, which included remnants of armored and artillery units that had been cut off during the initial German breakthrough, as well as his own paratroopers. On December 22nd, the German commander demanded McAuliffe's surrender. McAuliffe's reply was a single word: nuts. The story of that reply is one of the most famous in American military history. Less well known is what was happening while McAuliffe's men held Bastogne. Patton's Third Army was executing one of the most impressive staff operations of the entire war, turning 90 degrees north in 72 hours, and driving 4 divisions through winter conditions toward Bastogne from the south. On December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through the German encirclement and reopened a corridor into Bastogne. The siege was lifted, but the battle wasn't over. Eisenhower made the decision that defined his generalship on December 19, 1944. Facing the largest crisis of his command, his front broken, 2 divisions captured or destroyed, communications disrupted across an 80-mile gap, he called his senior commanders together at Verdun and told them something that most of his subordinates hadn't been able to articulate yet. The German offensive wasn't a disaster, it was an opportunity. Every German tank and soldier committed to watch on the Rhine was a tank and soldier that wasn't in a prepared defensive position, waiting for the Allied advance into Germany. By coming out of their defenses, the Germans had exposed themselves to exactly the kind of open warfare where Allied air power and industrial superiority were most decisive. The correct response wasn't to plug the line and hold. It was to let the Germans advance until their supply lines overextended, and then cut them off. It was, in structural terms, the same logic that Manstein had applied at Kharkov in 1943. And Eisenhower applied it with the same confidence of a man who understood that the strategic situation favored him, regardless of what was happening on the tactical map. He split command of the northern sector to Field Marshal Montgomery, which caused political controversy with American generals who considered it an insult to the U.S. Army. He gave Patton the green light to drive north into the German flank as fast as he could move. And he trusted the men holding Bastogne, Lanzerath Ridge, and the other critical points on the German advance to hold until the counteroffensive could be organized. The weather cleared on December 23rd. Allied air power, which had been grounded by the same cloud cover that had been the German operation's most important ally, unleashed on the exposed German supply lines, fuel convoys, and armor with an intensity that the Luftwaffe could not contest. German tanks that had advanced 30 miles into Belgium now found themselves out of fuel, with resupply convoys being destroyed from the air before they could reach the forward units. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had advanced to within 4 miles of the Meuse on December 24th, ran out of fuel. It was destroyed in place by American armor and air power over the following 2 days. The closest German unit to the Meuse never crossed it. The offensive had failed. What remained was the question of how much it would cost both sides before it was over. General Omar Bradley, commander of 12th Army Group and the officer responsible for the sector where the German offensive struck, wrote in his memoirs about the first days of the Battle of the Bulge with a frankness that few American commanders of his generation permitted themselves. I have been asked many times whether I should have seen the German offensive coming. The honest answer is, probably. The intelligence was ambiguous, but there were signs that a more skeptical officer might have weighted differently. What I can say in my defense is that the prevailing assumption, that Germany was too depleted to mount a major offensive, was shared by virtually every senior Allied officer, including those whose job it was to challenge such assumptions. When an institution develops a consensus, it becomes very difficult for any individual within it to argue against that consensus, even when the evidence supports doing so. That is what happened in December 1944. We were wrong, together. Bradley's admission, "We were wrong together," is one of the most honest assessments of institutional groupthink that any senior American military officer has ever offered about a major failure on his watch. It also captures something that goes beyond the specific circumstances of December 1944, the way in which shared assumptions become impervious to contrary evidence, precisely because they are shared. The Battle of the Bulge has a specific resonance in American memory that separates it from almost every other major engagement of World War II. It is the battle where American soldiers, not just the paratroopers of the 101st or the veterans of Patton's Third Army, but green troops like the 99th Infantry and the 106th Infantry, who had never seen serious combat, performed under conditions that tested everything that military training could provide, and discovered something about their own capacity that no training could have taught them in advance. The 16 men of Buch's platoon at Lanzerath Ridge, who held for a day against a German regiment. The soldiers of the 101st in Bastogne, who answered a surrender demand with a single word. The drivers and mechanics who kept Patton's trucks moving through ice and snow at speeds that German planners had calculated were impossible. These were ordinary Americans doing things that the German calculation of American fighting capability had assumed they would not do. That miscalculation, the German assumption that American troops would break under the shock of a surprise offensive, that American political leadership would lose the will to continue when casualties mounted, that the alliance between the Americans and the British was brittle enough to be split by a crisis, was as consequential as any tactical factor in the battle's outcome. Germany was wrong about what Americans would do when their backs were against the wall. They found out at Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge ended in mid-January 1945, with the German salient eliminated and the front restored roughly to where it had been in December. The cost on both sides was enormous. Approximately 75,000 American casualties, 100,000 German casualties, with the Germans suffering the additional loss of irreplaceable armor and air assets that they could not replace. Hitler's gamble had failed completely, not just tactically, but strategically in every dimension he had hoped to effect. Antwerp was never threatened. The Allied coalition did not fracture. The Americans did not seek a negotiated peace. And the German divisions committed to watch on the Rhine were not available to resist the Soviet winter offensive that began on January 12, 1945. An offensive that drove from the Vistula to the Oder in 3 weeks and put Soviet forces within 40 miles of Berlin. The fundamental flaw in Hitler's plan was not tactical. It was a misreading of the strategic situation so complete that no amount of tactical success could have corrected it. Even if the Germans had reached Antwerp, which was never realistic given their fuel shortages, they would have achieved a temporary disruption of Allied supply, not a political transformation of Allied will. Eisenhower's armies could be resupplied from other ports. The American public's commitment to the war was not dependent on a single city in Belgium. And the Soviet Union was not going to pause its offensive because Germany had scored a tactical success in the West. Hitler was trying to solve a strategic problem with a tactical operation. It's a category error that military history records over and over, in every era, in every theater. The resources committed to watch on the Rhine, the fuel, the armor, the elite divisions, might have extended German resistance on the Eastern Front by weeks. Committed to a single battle in the West, they bought nothing. The lesson of the Bulge is not about heroism at Bastogne, though the heroism was real. It's not about intelligence failure, though the failure was real. It's about what happens when a leader mistakes the only available action for a viable action. Germany in December 1944 had no good options. Watch on the Rhine was the least bad option available. But least bad available is not the same as capable of changing the outcome. Eisenhower understood something that Hitler never fully grasped, that the Battle of the Bulge was not a crisis. It was a gift. Germany had come out of its defenses and exposed itself to the conditions where Allied advantages were most decisive. The correct response to a gift is not panic, it's to take it. He did. And 6 months later, the war in Europe was over.